Started?
Look at it.
All right, great. So we have David Paul with us, Kevin Zeese and Margaret Flowers on one video, and Adrian Pine as well. Welcome to the Venezuela Solidarity community. Thank you so much for being with us this evening. We are live streaming on Facebook right now as well, at Alliance for Global Justice. I'll put the link in the chat bar in just a minute. But I want to first go over a few housekeeping items about this Zoom platform that we're using. There is a chat bar where you can communicate with presenters and other attendees. And please introduce yourself if you like. You can share any helpful links or resources if you have them. You can communicate with just the panelists or with panelists and attendees, so with everybody. So please feel free to use that as you'd like. We are going to be saving the last 15 minutes for Q&A. So please submit your Q&A or your questions at any time during the presentation, and we'll take the last 15 minutes to take your questions. So I think that we are ready to get started. So once again, welcome to everyone joining us this evening. We are back with our monthly Venezuela webinar series. I will introduce our speakers and then turn it over to them. They're each going to present for about 10 minutes. And then, like I said, we'll take your questions in the end. So we are joined by Margaret Flowers, who is co-founder of the Embassy Protection Collective. She is co-director of Popular Resistance as well. In March 2019, she was part of a delegation of Venezuela organized by the U.S. Peace Council. Flowers co-hosts Clearing the Fog, a weekly podcast with Kevin Zeese, and her writing appears regularly in outlets such as Truthdig, Counterpunch, and Dissident Voice. We are also joined by David Paul, solidarity activist and self-described concerned citizen. He felt a responsibility to speak out against the current U.S. intervention in Venezuela. He was part of the End Venezuela Sanctions delegation in April of this year, and to protest U.S. intervention and to support Venezuela's sovereignty, he joined the Embassy Protection Collective. So welcome, David. We are also joined by Adrian Pine. She is a militant medical anthropologist who has worked in Honduras, Mexico, Korea, and the United States, Egypt, and Cuba. Prior to and following the 2009 military coup in Honduras, she has collaborated with numerous organizations and individuals to bring international attention to the Honduran struggle to halt U.S. government-supported state violence. And finally, we are joined by Kevin Zeese, who is co-founder of the Embassy Protection Collective and co-director of Popular Resistance. He has visited Venezuela twice in the last year as part of a delegation organized by the Intrepid News Fund to observe the presidential elections, and the second time in March as part of a peace and solidarity delegation to Venezuela organized by the U.S. Peace Council. So these 4 embassy protectors were unlawfully arrested and charged with trespassing and interfering with U.S. Department of State's protective functions in May. They are now mounting a legal defense and an education campaign. So I will turn the mic over to them for their presentations, and go ahead and take it away, Margaret. Wait, we don't.
There we go. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. Sorry. Thank you, Elaine, for putting this together. And thank you to everyone who's joining the panel tonight for this conversation. I wanted to give a little bit of background to why we protected the embassy in April and May of this year. So folks may know that ever since Hugo Chavez was elected in 1998 and started using Venezuela's resources to end poverty and provide basic necessities for the people of Venezuela, the United States has been, trying to undermine that and overthrow what they refer to in Venezuela as the Bolivarian process. And the most recent attempt was in January of this year, when the United States supported a person who became the president of the National Assembly. It wasn't his turn, who was trained in the United States at George Washington University and by canvass a regime change operation and who took part in violent right-wing protests in Venezuela in 2014. The US backed him when he declared himself in January the interim president of Venezuela. And then that was quickly also backed by Canada and by some European allies and right-wing countries in Latin America. And so, he did this coup attempt, but it failed. And he was not the president of Venezuela. He had no presidential power in Venezuela. Nicolas Maduro was the president and was operating as the president. But the United States continued to pretend that this person was the president and started turning over Venezuela's assets that were in the United States to him. And so this meant turning over Citgo to him and the oil money in the United States. It meant handing over the UN consulate in New York City and the military attaché offices in Washington, D.C. And we were actually in Venezuela in March when the UN consulate was handed over and the attaché offices were handed over. And there were activists in the United States who went to those locations as soon as they found out what was going on. But because they were outside and because the US police forces were assisting this fake president and his people in having access to these facilities, the activists were not able to stop it. And so on April 9th of this year, there was another big change that happened. The Organization of American States, which is a very US-dominated institution, changed its rules just kind of willy-nilly so that they only needed a majority vote to recognize this person, Juan Guaido, this US-led coup person, as president of Venezuela. And so they changed the rules. They pushed through a vote to recognize him. And the next day, the two Venezuelan OAS diplomats who were still in Washington, D.C., working in Washington, D.C., were ordered to leave the United States within 2 weeks. Normally, they would have 2 months, but they were only given 2 weeks. So we went down that next day to the Venezuelan embassy along with Medea Benjamin of Code Pink and also in consultation with the Answer Coalition, and asked if we could be in the embassy and stay in the embassy so that if the US tried to hand over this property to Juan Guaido's ambassadors, fake ambassadors, that we would actually be in there. Maybe we could stop them from taking it over. And so they, kind of agreed at first, a little bit, not sure, they knew who we were, but didn't really know, is this actually going to work? And what are we actually preparing to do and all that kind of thing. And over those 2 weeks that the ambassadors, diplomats were here, we built a level of trust. They worked with us as we decided that we needed to put our message on the embassy because we knew that if the corporate media came and covered this, they would not cover it accurately. And so we decided to paint banners. We had an amazing art build where people came from the community, and we put large banners up on the embassy. We put some placards on the front with the permission of the staff that listed US regime change tactics as well as outcomes of US regime operations. And we also put a whole timeline. There were 32 windows along the sidewalk portion of the embassy. And so we put a whole timeline of the US coup there, really trying to educate the public about what was going on, why we were there, and making sure that if the corporate media took photos of the embassy, that our messages would already be in them. And for the first few weeks, we were organizing public events every night, educational and cultural events. And we had, lots of people coming to those. We also did some national webinars out of there. And we were freely coming and going from the embassy, without any problems, without any police problems at all. And actually at the height of people being with us, we had as many as 70 or more people sleeping at the embassy. We were very well organized, taking care of it. We had people who were in charge of food, people in charge of cleaning, in charge of, we watered the plants. We did nonviolence trainings as well, people in charge of helping people find a place to sleep. There were lots of offices with couches that we could use, and of course, floor space. And, it was going really well up until the US tried another coup attempt on April 30th. And the next day, or I guess it was that day, a very angry, violent mob of pro-coup people showed up at the embassy, and everything changed from that point forward. We were under siege. So I don't want to take too much time, but I just want to kind of set the background for the very difficult part of the US trying to oust us from the embassy using terrorism. And I'll stop there if David or Adrian want to pick up over.
David's next.
Hello? Is the sound okay?
Yes, it is.
Okay. Just went blank. Yeah, I just want to add a little context to what brought me there and how I see this, the coup attempt and trying to hand over the Venezuelan embassy to people who were not authorized, who were not elected, who were not representing the government, how that was just part of a general pattern of criminal foreign policy of the United States around the world. Multiple interventions. I won't go into all the details. People know some history, would see the long list of interventions, not just in Latin America, but all over the world. And basically a perpetual war of and breaking international law, breaking treaties. And our government has been acting like a gangster, a crooked cop on the beat in the world, basically protecting profits for corporate and wealthy elites. I mean, it seems kind of cliche and simple, but I think that's the basic dynamic. And the United States government has been depending on this myth that a number of people have spoken about before, this myth of exceptionalism, that we do things in the world for good intentions, so it must be okay. And also the whole idea of militarism is so normalized and glorified in our society, it's basically, when you look at the interventions and the wars, it's really not wars to protect democracy, it's war on democracy, war on countries that trying an independent path, trying a independent social project, which Venezuela and the Bolivarian Revolution was. And what really bothersome to me is the scrutiny our government puts on these countries. And some of them, it's because they have natural resources that we want to exploit, or they're setting up an example of like the Bolivarian Revolution, of giving popular power to the people, empowering people in all kind of ways, diverting resources to the poor. And that's an example which corporate elites around the world do not want to keep alive and want to squash that idea. And how they get away with all this is basically propaganda. It's the mainstream media is so one-sided, doesn't give any context, no history, and use these terms, which we highlighted in some of those boards we had in the embassy as an educational posters to people, onlookers, how they demonize the leaders of these countries. They call them the opposition protesters, they call them democracy protesters. They create a humanitarian crisis with these illegal sanctions and coercive measures, and basically as a pretext to future intervention. And this current war on Venezuela takes many forms. It's an illegal economic war, which Obama Obama started with his act calling it Venezuela a threat to our security, which is actually, the truth is just the opposite. We're a threat to their security. And with these even worsening coercive measures by the Trump administration, the theft of their resources in international banks, the extortion, what they call sanctions, these coercive measures are actually killing people there. And although there were mistakes in certain management of certain things in the economy, they were not crimes. And what our country does was exploit those, makes them worse. And with the sanctions they've in practically almost total blockade, they are preventing the ability of the government of Venezuela to correct any of these problems. And because it's also a psychological threat on the people of Venezuela, the anxiety, the insecurity. And the other part of this war is this media blockade. Basically, you're not hearing the voices of the common people in Venezuela, the working people, the poor people. And we always hear in the news, all the 50 countries that support the US. They never talk about the 120 that don't support the US policy, the majority of the world, and actually majority of the world population. So this, there's dishonesty in the media, there's dishonesty in their portrayal of the motives of our country. And that was very, very clearly seen in the embassy. This part of the coup, which was the attempt to take over the embassy by this opposition right-wing mob. And some of the examples of their dishonesty, which is coming out in accusations against us and other people part of the collective, like Max Blumenthal, is they just make up things. Like on Vecchio's website, he showed pictures of damage that the opposition did and said it was us. So it's not surprising, but when they don't get what they want, they use violence and they use lies. And I felt I think we all do a real responsibility to speak up and tell the truth and hold our government accountable. And that's why we were at the embassy. And that's why we want to continue speaking about the issues that it brings up. And I think it's really important. Maybe some people don't say it enough, I think, and I don't hear enough about it, but not to be shy about the positives of the whole Bolivarian process, what they've done for the people. And there's many quotes and studies from the United Nations, like the Human Development Index, showing how they've, in terms of housing and healthcare and inequality, they have had great improvements, more than almost any country in Latin America. And we have to highlight those positives of the process, which our government is trying to squash. And also connect the militarism to not just from a moral reason, but also the economic effects in this country to try to reach people, because we got to really connect those dots. There's an old quote by Eisenhower. I won't even try to paraphrase it, but where he talks, apart from his farewell speech talking about the military-industrial complex, he had another nice quote of saying, every bomber, takes away a school, every rocket, takes away healthcare. And we have to, I think, make those connections to this militarism of our foreign policy, its effects on other countries, but also how it's affecting here, so we can change the narrative and actually build. I think we're sort of in the beginnings. It can be of building a new anti-war movement. It can get discouraging when you go to rallies or marches and there's not enough people, but I think we're in sort of this, as someone said, a sort of an embryonic stage of reviving an anti-war movement, an anti-interventionist movement. And if we make the links to how it affects people here as well, I think we'll be more effective. So I'll just end there.
So Adrienne, are you gonna speak next? Great.
Sure. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. So I came into the embassy first because Medea gave me a call when I was in Honduras in April, asking if I could give a talk comparing the coup in Honduras in 2009 to what was going on at that time in Venezuela. So the attempted coup had already happened. It was still before the attempted military coup on April 30th, however. I remember at the time I said, look, I'm really busy. I've got a lot going on. Can I do it in a few weeks? And she said, hey, we don't know how long we're going to be here. So I said, okay, I'll make the time. I'll make it in. So I got to go in before the embassy was under siege and participate in one of the public events that were being held. And when I went in and did that, I was just amazed at the solidarity, at the diverse group of activists and people who were really there out of love. And for me, what was most powerful, I mean, what I went in to speak about was the impact that that the U.S. supported coup has had in Honduras over the past 10 years. How devastating that has been for the country, and how, you know, having seen and lived through the violence of a U.S. coup and where it can lead, where it does almost always lead, that it was my responsibility to prevent that, to do everything in my power to join alongside other people who are fighting to prevent the United States from, you know, taking out governments on a whim because it simply doesn't like them. So I guess what I would like to do now is just to talk a little bit about what I have seen in Honduras, the talk that I gave, something along those lines in mid-April, because that was what inspired me to come back again and again to the embassy until, you know, I actually returned on April 30th, just with the intent of staying one night. And at that point we were besieged, and I realized I needed to continue until the end. But it was sort of that experience of inspiration that led me to realize I needed to be there. So what I've seen in Honduras, I imagine that our viewers tonight will be aware that there was a recently concluded trial in the Southern District Court of New York against the brother of the president of Honduras, the illegal narco dictator of Honduras, whose name is Juan Orlando Hernandez. So his brother, Tony Hernandez, was captured last November in Miami and was on trial this past month for drug trafficking. He was guilty, and he was found guilty by a jury on all 4 counts. He'll be in jail for life. But what's more significant is that the trial exposed on a broad public level something that Hondurans have known for quite a long time, which is that their government is a narco dictatorship. Every level of the government is part and parcel of the drug trafficking industry. The entire National Party has been elected through drug money. And this has all happened under the watch of the State Department and the CIA that have known full well all along that this is going on, but have allowed it to happen because Juan Orlando Hernandez has been their ally, even as he was not only drug trafficking, of course, but running death squads, militarizing the entire country, criminalizing and murdering people who his opponents. And, you know, and so this is sort of what we're seeing 10 years later, but every step of the process from the coup up until now has been one of US supported violence. And one thing that is key to point out again and again and again, because in the way that public discourse works in this country in this moment, is that people still think that Republicans and Democrats are somehow different. On the issue of Honduras, they have not been different. On the issue of Venezuela, they have not been different. Honduras, the coup in 2009 would not have succeeded, I fully believe this, without the full support of Hillary Clinton and her State Department. She has taken credit for the success of the coup in her books, and I certainly take her word on that, having seen the actions that her State Department took to ensure that the coup stood in the months following it, the June 28, 2009 coup against Mel Zelaya. some of the things that immediately happened following the coup were, in addition to the incredible violence that was carried out by state security forces against anybody who opposed it, were basically the privatization of everything. I mean, that's what these coups are about. They're about moving away from a model that is providing some level of social equity. In Venezuela, that is a much greater level than it was in Honduras under Mel Zelaya, but nonetheless, Mel Zelaya's efforts to provide higher minimum wage, to provide pensions for elderly people, to provide better access to education for children, and also, most importantly, to provide the opportunity for a referendum on whether or not there should be a constituent assembly to rewrite the 1982 Constitution in Honduras that was written under a dictatorship and then provides a very unequal structure of power. It's very anti-democratic. Those things were enough for the elite class with the full backing of the State Department to oust that president. So their goals then were immediately to reverse any social gains that had been made under Mel Zelaya and ensure that, that there could be a sort of hyper extractivist capitalist extractivism throughout the country. So very dangerous stuff, you know, opening concessions for gold mining in highly densely populated regions where this is basically a death sentence for local people whose water will become horribly toxic. And, you know, we've seen terrible health results, selling off the lands of indigenous people, of Garifuna people, selling off waterways. So we've seen this privatization of everything that has also included the absolute and total destruction of the healthcare and educational sectors. And so what this leads to, of course, is the mass exodus that we're seeing of Hondurans fleeing their country, both because there are no opportunities for them and because the impunity is so great that the violence has meant that, you know, they're not able to survive. It's an atmosphere of absolute terror. And having seen these impacts of the US support for a coup, I had to put my body in the way of this happening again, even if it was a small gesture. And I would do it again and again and again. The people of Venezuela deserve to make their own choices about the kind of government they want. And that is, frankly, none of my business and none of this country's business. They have that right. And I am sick of my government acting to take that right away from people. So that's all I'll say for now.
Thank you so much, Adrian and David and Margaret. I'm going to focus on the criminal charges that we're facing. First, I want to thank Yulia in the comments in the chat list for her commenting as a Venezuelan about appreciating what we did in the embassy. I just want to say we were lucky to be able to do it. It was an honor for us to be able to do it. And I want to say we're so lucky to have had people like Adrian and David in the embassy with us with their deep experience in Central America, Cuba, and Latin America more generally. Really, the four of us were 4 of 70 who slept in the embassy, and hundreds of people outside, probably more than 1,000 outside, who defended us on the outside. So we're kind of a representation. We are not the Embassy Protection Collective. It's much larger than that. And we're facing criminal charges, but that's why we're the 4 who are being talked about. I want to first talk about Max Blumenthal. He was arrested this weekend on Friday morning and didn't get out till 7 o'clock on Saturday night after he was arraigned. He could have been arraigned on Friday. In fact, they could have let him know he was facing prosecution. He could have voluntarily come in, but instead they sent a SWAT team-like group of police out to surround his house at his home in his neighborhood. He was put into a police vehicle, a wagon, and taken away in handcuffs in front of his neighbors, and then forced into a very uncomfortable situation for a full day and 2 days, actually, till 7 p.m. on Saturday. So that was a political arrest. That was an arrest because the Gray Zone Project, which if you don't know the Gray Zone Project, you should know the Gray Zone Project. The Gray Zone Project had an embedded media person, Anya Pariampol, in the embassy with us. As we also had Mintwood Media in the embassy with us, with Alex Rubenstein, and there were great reporting from Telesur and some of the other reporters outside. And so the arrest of Max was retribution for that and for their incredible coverage of Venezuela. They exposed Juan Guaido being trained in the United States at George Washington University by neoliberal economists. They exposed Carlos Vecchio for being now being investigated for embezzling tens of millions of dollars from Citgo. And they've covered Nicaragua, Syria, Hong Kong, all of the spots where U.S. regime change is active. Gray Zone has been there, and that is why Max is being punished. I'm sure he'll be found not guilty or the charges even dropped because they are baseless, but we'll let that play out in court, just as our case will. In our case, we are being charged with interfering with protective function. This is the first time that we can find that this statute's been used against an embassy. It's usually been used involving people, like ambassadors who are being protected and someone getting in the way of that or intruding in that. It's even been rarely used there. And the reason they charged that because we were in the embassy legally. We were not violating the law. We had the permission of the elected government of Venezuela, recognized under Venezuela law, recognized by the United Nations, recognized by more than 150 nations. Clearly the government always has been in power. Juan Guaido has never had a day as president or any presidential power, and Carlos Vecchio has never had a day of having any power as an ambassador. It's a total fraud. These people are puppets of the United States, and that's what they were being used for in the embassy. So that with that potential, that crime that we're facing of interfering with protective function, which we found so ironic because we saw ourselves as interim protectors, as Venezuela and the U.S. were negotiating how to protect the embassy with a third country. Switzerland had agreed to protect the Caracas embassy of the U.S., and Turkey had agreed to protect the Washington, D.C. embassy of Venezuela. Venezuela had agreed to both, and U.S. wanted the Caracas embassy protected, but was not ready yet to agree to the Georgetown embassy being protected by Turkey. That was being negotiated as we were arrested. We told the police we would voluntarily leave if that agreement was negotiated when there was a protecting power. Protecting powers have been used for hundreds of years. They are in every major convention on embassies. U.S. currently has 20 protecting power agreements with other nations around the world, so it's not an unusual thing, and it really is the lawful way to handle the Georgetown embassy and the Caracas embassy. We're facing up to 1 year in jail and a $100,000 fine. We are really lucky that a coalition of groups has come together to help defend us. If you go to defendembassyprotectors.org, I put it in the chat box at the top of the chat box. You can see it. defendembassyprotectors.org. You can get the latest updates on our case. You can help other people understand the case. We have a frequently asked question page, which is designed to enable you to write about our case and answer questions about it, and spread the word. You can also donate to our defense fund. We've raised about half of what we want to raise initially, so we're still raising money. I just finished a tour in Illinois of 5 stops, and Margaret and I with David did a tour in Northern California, 7 stops a week before that, and we are planning tours in Florida, tours in New York, New Jersey, and the Northeast, and open to doing others if people want to organize tours, because we want to use our case to educate people about Venezuela, the coup, and help us stop the coup, and to organize and mobilize people to really work together to end this U.S. policy of intervention in Venezuela and around the world. We have a great legal defense team, although we're not getting much help from the government. The government is making everything difficult. We actually lost 2 of our initial lawyers because the court and the government would not schedule hearings taking into account their trial schedule. So we lost 2 out of 4 of our lawyers. We're in the process of replacing both of those lawyers, and we're using a joint defense agreement so that our four of us are working together with our lawyers in a common defense. We feel like we have a strong defense, which I won't get into here, but we feel like we have a strong defense, and we will do what we can to win this. We think it would be a tremendous victory for the people of Venezuela and against this coup if a jury acquits us. And if a jury acquits us and finds we were not doing anything illegal, that's another signal that the U.S. population does not support U.S. intervention and coup d'etat attempts in Venezuela and other countries. Let me just finish by making one other point. I know many people on this call are following closely events in Latin America. In two out of our last 3 newsletters at Popular Resistance, we've covered these events. We do weekly news analysis, and there's so much going on in Latin America that required us to cover it 2 weeks ago. We covered 12 countries that were either in revolt or in the process through elections of changing their conservative neoliberal governments and moving toward ending neoliberalism and ending U.S. domination. We did a second newsletter this last weekend focused on Chile and Bolivia because so much is happening there. There really is a new pink tide that is emerging. After it receded during the Obama era, it's emerging once again in the Trump era. And there's many reasons for this, but I think the Guaido effect is not irrelevant. I don't want to give Guaido credit. I'm really giving credit to U.S. extremism. The fact that the United States would select an unknown low-level legislator who barely got into the National Assembly came in second place in the second smallest state in Venezuela. The fact that they would pick Juan Guaido, who 85% of the Venezuelan people didn't know, to be their puppet president, and then immediately worked, and Vice President Pence called him the night before. He announced saying, do it, we'll support you. And then the next day, as soon as the announcement was made, President Trump was endorsing it and getting right-wing governments, many of which are under attack now in Latin America and their U.S. allies in Western Europe to join in. There's still only 50 countries out of 200 in the world, so it's a small minority, but they've been using that to try to make these claims. Now, what I call the Guaido effect is that overreach by the United States, manipulating the OAS rules to recognize Guaido when he couldn't pass muster under the normal rules requiring a 2/3 majority. The Guaido effect of seizing Venezuelan properties like Citgo and distributing those profits to the fake puppet Guaido. The taking of the UN missions in New York City of Venezuela, taking the military attachés buildings in Washington, D.C. that were Venezuela, and now invading the Venezuelan embassy in order to take that embassy. By the way, we've learned after came out and we're finished with our arraignment, we saw a video that showed that on the day that the pro-coup mob came to the embassy in Washington, D.C., they were doing the same thing in other embassies in Latin America and other countries. This was obviously a strategic tactic used by the U.S. coup mongers. It failed everywhere. And even in Georgetown, that embassy is now still vacant. Vecchio was able to go and do a photo op for about an hour, take some pictures, get a picture at the window, and then he was out, and the doors have been closed ever since. He never had the powers of an ambassador. He couldn't, give a visa to anybody because he has no governmental power. So he's a fraud. And so he's not in the embassy. The embassy is vacant at this stage. So we are, focused on this defense. They've given us a lot of unimportant discovery. Police body cams, over 800 of them, which we have to go through to find the 1 or 2 that are relevant. 24,000 WhatsApp messages and emails between police, mostly irrelevant. And we're seeking more relevant documents. And for example, any conversations or negotiations between the Trump administration and the Maduro government. It's not Juan Guaido that can grant protecting power to Switzerland in Caracas. It's only President Maduro. And it's not anything that U.S. wants from the government of Venezuela, they can only get from President Maduro. So we're seeking documents that show that while Trump is saying Guaido is the president, they know that in fact Maduro is the president. In fact, Elliot Abrams made the mistake of telling the truth about that when he was asked about the coup with the media. Under Venezuelan law, after 30 days, an election is required when you have an interim president. When the 30 days ran out, the media asked, where's the election? The response was, well, the reason there's no election is because Maduro is still in power. So Abrams admitted Maduro was still in power. And so even the day after we were told by the government that we had to leave, the Venezuelan government was telling us we had the right to stay. So we have a strong defense. We're pursuing it aggressively. We're up against the United States. And so we're so grateful to people who come together to support our effort by going to defendembassyprotectors.org. And we're so appreciative of people who are spreading the word. We saw the media blackout around the embassy action, which is amazing that they blacked that out because it was such an unusual, unique moment that people in the United States would go into an embassy to defend it for another country. That was never happened before. And it was blacked out there, but people in Venezuela knew about it. We saw all sorts of marches supporting us and songs written for us. It's just like, it was amazing to see that solidarity, and we want to return that solidarity. So thank you all for coming. We look forward to having a conversation with you about this issue and related issues. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much to Kevin, Margaret, Adrian, and David for your presentations. We're going to move into the Q&A now. So I have some questions already here to get started, but if you'd like to submit your questions, you can do so using that Q&A box found in the lower icon bar of your screen for those of you who are connected through Zoom and on the computer. So if some of these questions are directed to somebody specific, and then some of the others, I'll just open up and someone can jump on it. So feel free to come back on video when you're ready. I'll start off with a question about the legal basis, and you touched on this a little bit, Kevin, already, what the legal basis is for your stay in the Venezuela embassy, and also what made it illegal for the DC police and Secret Service to enter and arrest you. Can you talk a little bit about that? I know you started talking about the Vienna Convention. Oh, I'm gonna unmute you.
The Vienna Convention of 1961 requires the host government, that's the United States, to protect all embassies in its jurisdiction. And it forbids anyone entering that embassy, including the United States, without the permission of the country, in this case, Venezuela. So under the Vienna Convention, the embassies are inviolate. And it means they can't be violated. It requires the country of Venezuela to give the U.S. permission. And so that is, I think, what prevented them from coming in. When they came to the door one night and cut the locks on the front door and asked us if we would leave, we explained that we were there legally, that we had the permission of the Venezuelan government. We had received permission from the foreign minister, for the vice foreign minister. We'd received permission from the UN ambassador to Venezuela, and we know President Maduro was following our protection of the embassy as well. So every level of government, we received permission. We were not trespassing. They gave us a key so we'd come and go. We told the government that we didn't have to break the locks on the door like they did because we had a key. We also told the government that if they came in, they'd be the ones violating international law. They'd be the ones violating the Vienna Convention. And they'd be putting all embassies in the world at risk, including U.S. embassies. They'd be putting all personnel at risk, including U.S. personnel. So if they entered this embassy in violation of the Vienna Convention, they are the ones who would be blamed for future problems with ambassadors and embassy officials and at U.S. embassies around the world. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, thank you. We also have a question about asking kind of the timeline and how, if you could kind of describe how you were arrested and what has happened since.
I can take this unless someone else wants to take it. Okay. So the timeline of our arrest, we were on May, I guess it was the 13th, it was a Monday. The police started putting notices up on the outside of the embassy. Of course, we couldn't read them because we were inside the embassy, but we heard what they were doing, and we saw the fire department show up, as well as a lot of police show up, and there were hundreds of people outside, our supporters as well as Venezuelan opposition. And so we expected that the police were going to try to break in and arrest us. And we did a video with one of our embedded media people, Alex Rubenstein of Mint Press News. We also had Anya Parempel of the Gray Zone Project in there, as was another embassy protector. We did a little video kind of explaining what was going on in our position. And then the police came to the front door, the fire department cut off the locks. We went to the lobby and we stood there in the lobby as they opened the doors, and they didn't cross the threshold. They said they had an eviction notice, and they put copies of it on the floor for us. And the notice was printed on plain paper with no letterhead, no agency, no signature. And it basically said that Carlos Vecchio, the fake ambassador, was, ordering us to leave. We knew that we weren't trespassing. We knew that we hadn't broken any law. So when they asked us if we would voluntarily leave, we said no. We had an exchange with the police for quite a while, explaining to them the important ramifications of them violating the Vienna Convention, such as embassies not being protected. Also, the potential of escalation of conflict, which could become a global conflict because Russia and China are supportive of Venezuela, and it would be a regional conflict as well. And so after some back and forth, and they consulted with their superiors, they said that they were going to leave. They shut the doors, they put zip ties around them, and said they would have officers outside if we wanted to leave. So that was really amazing. And a couple of days after that, we did email them a notice and said that, we felt that we were there legally, but we wanted them to know that if they came into the embassy, we would not run or hide or blockade or resist in any way. Things were going well. On Wednesday, Jesse Jackson showed up, and he was able to deliver some food into the embassy. He carried the food over with some supporters. One of the pro-coup people grabbed the rope that we threw down with a bag on it to bring the food up, and a bunch of people scuffled with him to get the food, but the police didn't intervene, I think because Jesse Jackson was in the middle of it, and we were able to get 3 bags of food up. So that was really amazing and a game changer, because Jackson said he was going to come back with more people. And so we were starting to get more favorable media. We were getting more supporters out there. We were getting, people who were prominent, who were having the courage to come down and support us. And so I think that really—
And we had food.
Yeah. We had been really rationing our food and rationing our water because we didn't have power or water except for what we had saved. And so the next morning, Thursday morning, we get this phone call at 9 a.m. And it was just a fluke that Kevin's phone was on. They said, we have a warrant for your arrest, and you have to come out. Kevin said, I'm going to call my lawyer. The next thing we knew, there was a battering ram. They were using a battering ram to batter in one of the side lower doors when they could have just cut the zip ties on the front door and walked in. So they arrested us. We were held for 30 hours before our arraignment. And then we were released we have to call pretrial services every week. We can't travel out of the US without permission from the court. And we've had a series of status hearings and these kind of getting all of these discovery dumps that the government has dumped on us, and this fight for us to try to get the discovery that we need in order to defend ourselves, and this kind of fight over the schedule, and now losing 2 of our lawyers. Right now they're pushing for a trial in February. We feel like that's a little early because there's still so much to do. And now we have to get these new lawyers up to speed once we find them and meet with them. So we'll see how things go. Over.
And can you give us an update on what the current status of the Venezuela embassy in DC is, and in other parts of the United States?
Well, I talked about it a little earlier. The embassy is vacant. Vecchio was allowed to come in for a brief photo op, holding a flag and saying he got the embassy back. Then they closed it down, and it's vacant, and no action is going on there. For people who need a visa, you have to actually go to the Canadian embassy. There's a Venezuelan desk at the Canadian embassy. That was true before we entered the embassy and was true after. And that's the only place that there's any actual real embassy work being done, is that Venezuelan desk in the Canadian embassy. Over.
So then there's just a comment for Adrian Pine next. It says, listening to Adrian's talk, it occurred to me that it might be very uplifting to the people of Venezuela to hear what she might have to say. So putting it on some media outlets that could, with some Spanish subtitles, might be a morale booster. So I just wanted to share that with everybody. That's a really good suggestion. Thank you for that. But that also brings up the issue of media, and some of y'all touched on that already, but can you comment on the kind of media coverage you all got, and then also just in general, the media coverage of the Bolivarian Revolution, and how difficult it is to actually get truth and good information about what's happening?
Who wants to take that?
I mean, I think any of us could comment generally. You guys probably have more specific things to say because Popular Resistance does such a good job of counteracting the media, silence on these issues. But one of the things that's been particularly frustrating to me is the hypocrisy in terms of how the media covers some protests and doesn't, or creates some protest movements, right, and doesn't cover others at all. Again, in the case of Venezuela and Honduras, there's actually a piece that came out today in Jacobin, I think, with Terry Mattson, who is the Code Pink, with Code Pink works on Venezuela and Honduras, and a co-author, and just sort of comparing the coverage on Honduras and Venezuela. Honduras, a country where there are, in fact, massive, rampant human rights violations that are coming from the government at such an institutionalized level, and a government that is, in fact, a cartel. Whereas in Venezuela, you have rhetoric about this, but it's not actually happening, and it gets massive coverage in the media. And whenever there are human rights violations that occur, in Venezuela, which is rare, the government goes after those people who commit them. They're actually prosecuted. They're actually, the government does not permit that. Whereas in Honduras, there is just this level of impunity. Just 2 days ago, I think, one of the main potential future witnesses in a trial against Juan Orlando Hernandez for drug trafficking, based on the evidence that has already come out in federal court in the United States, was murdered in his jail cell in a maximum security prison, La Polva. A man named Magdaleno, that's his sort of, that's the name that he goes by, was murdered in a jail cell. The video was crystal clear. It was broadcast. Everybody on Facebook in Honduras saw it. And what happened was the police opened the door of his jail cell so that the hitmen could go in and kill this man who represented a threat to the president of Honduras. Is anything going to happen to the police? Is anything going to happen to the president? Of course not. They're going to, have the hitmen, who are other prisoners who were being probably coerced by the police or offered a whole lot of money, but, they're going to be held accountable. But this is, and then yesterday, or actually this morning, the main evidence warehouse of the public ministry in Progreso was burned to the ground because it held evidence of the government's complicity in drug trafficking. So is that getting any coverage in the US media? Not at all. But what we do hear about is Nicolas Maduro is behind the protests in all over the hemisphere. You know, I mean, just these absurd accusations. Actually, Guaido said this. He you know, and Piñera in Chile was blaming Maduro, and you know, Maduro actually went on, he, you know, it was almost like a skit on TV where he was saying, it's almost like I move my mustache and I topple a government, the way that they talk about it. And it really is that level of absurd. Of course, the people in Chile are rising up for their own reasons that have nothing to do with Nicolas Maduro, but very much overlap with the violence of neoliberalism, you know, throughout the hemisphere. You know, so we hear all sorts of exaggerated things about Venezuela as US propaganda and nothing about Honduras, precisely because Honduras is a US ally, regardless of it being a narco-terrorist, neoliberal, fascist dictatorship.
Yeah, I just want to say one thing is we have to keep referring people to alternative news sources. The social media, the group, from Gray Zone to Popular Resistance, and there's many others, to tell a different story. Because, you know, I just was this weekend with a group of old friends, and they said, everything I hear about, you know, from NPR to New York Times, everything's bad about Maduro. Have you checked anything else out? And people are unaware of these other sources. We have to keep promoting them and directing people to the alternative voices and to media where it's actually voices talking to Venezuelans in Venezuela. Their voice, we're trying to be a voice for them, but it would be good if they can have a more direct voice to talk to the American people. So we have to be aggressive about countering the disinformation with our own alternative sources, and to write letters to the editor, get on NPR radio, interview shows, whatever we can do. We have to attack it from many fronts.
Yeah, I just wanted to quickly add that when we were in Venezuela, we could see that what the U.S. was saying completely contradicted what was actually happening in Venezuela. Just one example, two examples were down there during the power outage, and the U.S. media was reporting that everything was in chaos, it was dangerous, and people were using dirty water from some lines to get that water. And the reality was people were completely calm. They were working together. Schools were closed and businesses were closed. So we saw people out in the park, families, people running, people eating ice cream. We saw people with big water jugs on trucks that they were taking to springs. There's a lot of these natural springs. Venezuela is also a tremendous resource for fresh water. And so they were working together to fill those. And then it was the same thing in the US. The Washington Post, which is right there in Washington, D.C., had a reporter that frequently came to the embassy, and she talked to us. But when she wrote her articles, she basically was quoting the Venezuelan opposition and barely, you know, not really even giving our viewpoint at all. So that's why, as David and others have said, the independent media is so essential. And so it was great to have Gray Zone and Mint Press News embedded with us, as well as Telesur was there for the whole time.
The only value in watching the corporate media or New York Times or the CIA Post, or better known as the Washington Post, that has a $600 million contract, or the owner has a $600 million contract with the CIA. The only reason to watch them is to know what the propaganda is from the United States government. The corporate media and those outlets work hand in glove with the U.S. security state. And when Russia and China are the top enemies in this era of great power conflict, you can't believe a thing you hear about that. When Venezuela is a target, you can't believe that either. So you go to those sites, those sources, just to get the propaganda, so you know what the security state's saying. But there are so many sites that cover the truth. Alliance for Global Justice deserves a lot of credit. You guys do a great job because you're connected to people in Honduras, Nicaragua, Venezuela, Colombia, and you report from those people. So that's like a great, first-person source almost. Popular Resistance, we see our job, and one of our jobs at Popular Resistance is to correct misinformation, because we saw in Syria when a false story gets into the anti-war movement or the peace movement, or the anti-imperialist movement, that false story is hard to get rid of and causes deep divisions. And so when we see a story like Hong Kong or Nicaragua or Venezuela or Honduras, we do our best to find people writing the truth, and then to bring people together into an article of our own analysis to get the truth out. And we hope that people will get our daily digest. You can get it for free at popularresistance.org. And if you see stories that are telling the truth, share them, because we have to be the media. Everybody on this call has to, I'm talking about the attendees as well as the panelists, we have to be the media, because the media is not going to serve the people. The media is serving corporate interests and the security state.
Thank you so much. And we are just past the top of the hour. So I will take this last comment and question from Canadian Solidarity activist Alison Bodine. A big thank you for your presentations tonight. People continue to be inspired by your struggle inside the embassy and by everyone outside the embassy also. We can see how the struggle in defense of Venezuela's sovereignty and self-determination continues to be important with the arrest of Max Blumenthal and your case. The US is failing at its many cruel and illegal attempts to overthrow the Venezuela government, and their attacks against solidarity organizers in the US will surely continue and increase as US becomes more desperate. Another reason for building a more unified and stronger anti-war and anti-imperialist movement. I'll continue. At the monthly protest actions in Vancouver and Canada in front of the US consulate, the Venezuela Solidarity Campaign and the Fire This Time movement for solidarity for social justice continues to demand drop all charges against Embassy Protection Collective and work on fundraising for the defense campaign. Her question is, do you think it is best for us, or who do you think it is best for us to direct our drop all charges demand at? Who wants to take this one?
The petition on the website. Wait, oh, we're open.
We have a petition on the website, defendembassyprotectors.org, that will actually deliver those demands for you. We're focusing on the line of command, basically. The Attorney General, Department of Justice is in charge of this prosecution, but we have a feeling the White House and State Department are directing it. The actions that the prosecutors are taking in our case and in the Blumenthal and Ben Rubenstein case, Max Blumenthal and Ben Rubenstein are co-defendants. In all these cases, the actions the prosecutors are taking look more political than legal. They took 5 months to serve the arrest warrant on Max Blumenthal. They've been 6 months going toward trial for Ben Rubenstein. It's a weak case. It should, in most cases like that, a simple assault would be no paper. It's a simple nothing case. Even if it were true, it would be nothing. But in this case, it's not true, and they have no evidence, and they know it. In our case, they had to come up with this bogus charge of interfering with embassy protection, a charge that's been rarely used. It's a case that should be dismissed. And so I think if you go to the defendembassyprotectors.org site, you can take that action calling for dismissal. We really appreciate you talking about raising money for the case. It is expensive. The downloading of the 800 videos required expensive technical help that we had to pay for, more than $1,000 of technical help just for that. So it is us against the U.S. government. And so we hope people go to embassyprotectors.org and get involved. We want to use this case to raise consciousness, end the Venezuelan coup, and defend ourselves so we get an acquittal and send a strong message to the people of the world that the people in the United States don't support this coup.
Elaine, can we do a quick plug for the Manitos Children's
Oh,
Fund?
yes, we should.
We're going to be doing a full webinar on that this month, so stay tuned for that, and we'd love to have you on for that as well. But I want to take this time to close out this webinar. Thank you so much to all of the panelists, and thank you so much for all of the participants for spending an hour of your evening tonight with us, learning more about this case. The website to follow along, it's been mentioned a few times, and it's in that chat bar, defendembassyprotectors.org. You can donate to their legal case there. There's a bar that shows how far along they are. They're just over halfway to their goal. So this is a really important thing that you can do to support this, to support these embassy protectors and the important actions that they've taken in solidarity with Venezuela. So thank you so much again, and good night.
Thank you all for attending. Thanks for having us on.
Thank you. Thank you, Elaine. Thanks, AFTJ.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye.